Hello, and thank you for clicking on my building modeling tutorial for 3Dsmax. I've been making buildings for various Grand Theft Auto mod projects for almost a decade now, and people have been asking me to teach them how to go about making building models themselves the same way I do. While I don't have the time to hold your hand and guide you personally, this video should be a good place to get started. We all have our strengths and weaknesses in modeling, and I'm not here to brag about my knowledge or people's lack thereof. I'm just here to show people who've been asking for years my process of modeling a building from start to finish. This tutorial requires you to have at least a rudimentary knowledge of 3Dsmax. You don't have to be an expert or have a doctorate in it, but knowing how to use the Create, Modify, etc. panels without having to constantly refer back to a guide will go a long way. I bought one of these guides from off the internet a decade or so ago, and I got a lot out of the first few chapters. Also, getting into the habit of saving, or hitting Ctrl+S, every couple of minutes is a great habit to get into, especially if your computer isn't as stable as you'd like it to be. Another thing I should mention is that your first model will not be your final. If you're just starting out modeling, you'll have to go through a lot of crappy models and designs before making something that's good. Me, myself, I made about 3 years worth of crap before I started making buildings I could say I was actually proud of. But again, this isn't a lesson on art theory. This is a tutorial on how to model buildings. First and foremost, all other questions, such as, what do I want my building to accomplish? What style do I want my models to be in? What defines a good building? Etc. should come after you have the knowledge of how to model buildings. With all that crap out of the way, let me introduce the first part of the tutorial, finding references. The easiest thing to model is something you have access to, be it modeling a building you see every day, a building you have a scale model of, a building you have blueprints readily available for, etc. I know for a fact you can model without any of these, and just do it by the seat of your pants. But the people who I'm making this video for want something a little more buttoned up and official. The first place to look for building references is places you know in real life. After all, what better inspiration is there than something right outside of your window? And if you're lucky enough, you might even have professional measurements of the building, such as architectural blueprints or boundary surveys for property lines. If you are unable to obtain these plans, there's no need to fear. If the building you want to make is on Google Maps, you can right-click the edges of the building and it can tell you the measurement between them. You don't need to make an intricate blueprint yourself, but something like this will certainly help. Nearby parked cars can also be a good size reference, which I'll explain in further detail later in this tutorial. Another place that's good for collecting reference material are property listing websites. If you can't find a picture of the house from a certain side, for example, and the house is listed for sale on a website, there's a good chance you'll be able to tell how many doors, windows, etc. are there just by going through the house listing. This method isn't strictly for houses either. You can go online and look up commercial real estate for sale or rent, office spaces for lease and so forth that you can use for references. One thing to make note of though, don't limit yourself to, for example, warehouse for sale. Instead, try searching warehouse for lease. The only difference is whether or not you own the property or if you're just renting the space, which really shouldn't make a difference either way. If you're wanting to model modern houses that look like something from a modern housing development, it might be worth your time looking up which development company owns that development. Chances are they have a list of floor plans already measured and listed for your reference needs. Conversely, in the opposite direction, if you're wanting to model older-looking bungalow houses that were common across North America in the early 1900s, you might want to look up catalog houses from companies like Sears, Harris, etc. Earlier in this guide, I mentioned having a scale model of a building you'd like to model in 3D. While this could be costly depending on the type of building you want to make, model buildings aren't that bad of a place to refer to, depending on the company, such as Fowler, Walther's Cornerstone, Summit Custom Cuts, They'll have an online presence where you can pull up the instruction manuals for how to put them together. These are extremely useful and shouldn't be discredited as reference material. I'm not going to sit here and list every single place you can get reference materials from. These are all just general ideas, which aren't applicable to everyone's needs. With all that out of the way, let's get started modeling a building. I only ask you not to deviate at all from this tutorial. I know it's tempting to go astray from the tutorial and make the building twice as tall or give it less windows than I do, but you can do that on your own time. This ain't time to dawdle, this is time to sit and learn how stuff is done. If you sit still and focus with the video, you can take away more skills sooner than someone who keeps dawdling would. The building I'm going to show you how to make is Faller, item 130315, a scale model of a German detached house. I believe it's based on a prefabricated home made by the Neckermann Strife Company. I'm not entirely sure, and I really don't want to spend an hour going through the history of prefabricated German houses from the 1970s. Let's just get to modeling. The building itself. Do you remember when I said that you could use a car to help you measure a building? For the sake of this tutorial, and also because I'm not the smartest when it comes to 3Dsmax measurements, I took the model house I'm recreating and put a model car next to it for size. The house looks like it's a car and a half or so long. Based on that, I first imported a car model and a pedestrian model into 3Dsmax before beginning anything. One thing that happens more often than not when you port models from GTA, they'll be right here in the middle of the black horizontal line, as opposed to being right on top of it. Let's move them to the top of that line now, as the top of the black horizontal line is where our building will begin. Next, get your references ready. As I said before, you can find model kit instructions very easily, as you can see on screen. I won't be following this to the exact letter, I'll just be eyeballing my own model of the house. But don't follow my bad habit. If you're going for accuracy, measure. The first thing we want to do is to make a box. This will form the basic shape of the house. In the command panel on the right, the Create tab is selected by default. Within this tab, under Standard Primitives, select Box. Once you have it selected, drag it once to make a footprint of the building, and then click again to make the height. Right-click on the box. Go to the Convert To selection at the bottom, and click on Convert to Editable Poly. Now we can properly edit the building. Select the roof and lower it to match the reference. You can be better about this, I'm just eyeballing it and being lazy. Don't be lazy like me. Learn from my mistakes so you can run circles around me in the future. Go into the Modify tab in the command panel. Click on the Edge selection and click on the two short edges on the roof. You can streamline this process by dragging your mouse over the two of them and clicking on Connect. I just copied my pedestrian model from GTA and brought him to the top of the roof so I can use him to gauge how tall the roof should be. Make sure you do your measurements like that in the 2D viewports, unless you think you can get it accurate in the 3D one. Select the edge that you created after connecting the two edges and raise it up to a little over the height of the pedestrian. Goddamn Europeans and their sloped roofs. Select the two vertexes on one side that form the low points of the roof, so the side of the house has an edge going between the first and second story. This will be helpful later on as we make our windows. Select the house and move it upwards by holding down the Shift button and moving the building up. Then, right-click it and select Hide Selection, so it's out of our way for now. We will use that basic shape of the house to make the LOD model later. Click under the Polygon selection in the Modify panel and click on the two angled roof pieces. Extrude the selected faces upward. This will make our roof trim, but don't let it get too high. Anything between 2 and 5 are good heights for roofs, at least in the weird scale GTA models have. Next, select the roof edges. This can be done quickly by selecting the whole roof and then Alt-clicking on the non-edge faces. Under the Edit Polygons panel, select the Extrude settings and then click on Extrude by Local Normal. Wait a minute, it's not supposed to look like that. Oh no! The faces are all askew! Don't worry, I know a second way to get good-looking extruded roof edges. Go back into the extrude settings, but this time, instead of extruding by local normal, click on by polygon. Do you see the faces right next to one another? Select them and delete them. I know it seems redundant at first, but the more optimized you make it now, the easier it will be going forward, especially into GTA. Now click on the furthest most vertex from the roof edge. Since we want the roof edge next to it to extend to its furthest most point, copy the Y selection, as seen in the coordinate display down below. Now that you have it copied, select the two furthest most roof edges on the other side next to it and copy-paste the coordinates into those vertexes. Y selection in its coordinate display. It's getting there. Now repeat the process for the remaining 3 corners of the roof. Now select the 2 vertexes you got the coordinates from. Turn on the snap toggle by hitting S on your keyboard and move them into the vertexes you just moved. Repeat this process for the remaining 3 corners. Once you do this, go into the side view that shows the gable end of the house and select the parts of the extruded roof that don't go down with the rest of the house. With them all selected, we will be manually dragging them with the pivot down to fit. Personally, I zoom into the side part that will be overlaying edges, and then in another viewport, I zoom into the pivot as close as I can so I can fine-tune any corrections. If the edges in the overlaying viewport are thick, that means something isn't lined up. You need to get the edges you're trying to overlay as thin as you can. Now look at the roof. See how there's 4 faces on one side of the roof? Let's optimize it and make it only one face. Select all 4 faces and delete them. Then select the 2 sloped edges across from one another in the Modify tab and then select Bridge. Now do the same for the other side of the roof. Congratulations! You turned 8 polys into 2. While I'm thinking about it, let me change the color of the house to something darker. This is just a matter of personal preference, but it's easier for me to see edges, imperfections, etc. if it's a darker color. As we can see on the original model, there is a break down the middle of the gable end for some siding. Let's make it by connecting the bottom of the house to the roof. Select the bottom edge, the edge through the middle separating what would be the first and second story, and then one to the roof. Click on Connect Settings, and use the slide control to move the edge to about where you think the split should begin on one edge. Just like we did with the roof edges before, copy the X coordinate from the middle vertex, and then paste it into the top vertex's coordinate panel so they line up. Uh-oh, that wasn't meant to happen. But don't worry, it's not the end of the world. Hit Ctrl-Z a few times to get rid of the edge, and we'll start over. It is imperative that we do not have broken faces. I repeat, it is imperative that we do not have broken faces. Let's try this again. Select the bottom and middle edges again, but this time, also select the 2 edges at the top of each slope. In the Connect Settings box, change the number of segments from 1 to 2, and drag the pinch option to make the second vertexes from the top of the new selection a little closer together. Select the top edge you created out of that and click on Remove from the Modify panel. Do not click Delete from your keyboard. It will fuck the whole thing up and get rid of the face. Select the 2 vertexes that Edge made and click on Remove. Again, do not hit Delete from your keyboard to get rid of these. Select one of the vertexes that is now connected to an edge making its way down to the bottom of the building and copy its X coordinate. Move the 2 vertexes it's connected to, going downwards to its position by pasting the top vertex's coordinate over those. Now do the same to the other side. Now it's starting to come together slowly but surely. Do what you just did to the other end of the house, as it is looking a little too bare. Oh shit! Be careful about dragging your mouse to select vertexes. Sometimes, when you think you have just what you need, it turns out you have too many, and by the time you know what's happening, the damage is irreversible. Just be mindful should you decide to drag and select. Now, to account for the 4 windows on each gable end of the house, we need to split the part we just did into 4. We can do this easily for the bottom half by selecting the bottom and middle edges and connecting them, but it'll be a little more tricky for the top one, as there is no flat horizontal surface to select. But don't worry, we can just connect the 2 vertexes and make a new edge between the one we just made and the top of the roof pitch. Modeling isn't about working hard anymore than it's about working smart. To gauge the size of doors on the long sides of the house, let's copy one of the pedestrian models and move them to where doors should be. This isn't Vice City. Let's try to get out stuff the right size. There's some break in the wall for some siding again on this side of the house as there was for the gable edges, so the easiest thing to do first is the break for the sidings, and then everything else. And don't forget to do the same for the other side, too. Each face will have at least one window on the long sides. Because of this, there's some windows to the left of the front door, as shown on the prototype model. Therefore, we need to connect the top and bottom edge to make the face ready for the window. That don't look too bad. In fact, forget about our old LOD model. Let's replace it with this. You'll see why in the future, when I get to the LODs. And don't forget to name your models as you go. It'll make placing them in-game a whole lot easier if things aren't known as Box 01, Box 02, etc. over and over again. In my experience, the best way to make windows and doors is to start by beveling the face. Select the face and, in the Modify tab, click on Bevel Settings. Make the height 0, and for the outline, eyeball it until you get what seems like the right size for the door. Obviously, do consider the height and width of the character model you use for reference. Good enough. Now select the bottom face from the bevel and delete it. Select the 2 vertexes from the bottom of the new face you made while beveling it, and in the coordinate display, type 0 in the Z-axis. Fine-tune the door height to your preference by selecting the vertexes around it and moving them at your leisure, whatever you think looks right. Making a window is the same as making a door, except you don't delete the bottom face, or send it all the way to the bottom of the building. More often than not, window heights will be the same as door heights, give or take a few inches. To streamline this process, copy-paste the z-axis coordinates for the door and put it on the top vertexes for the window. Yep, this is how you make windows. It's really not as hard as it looks, but I'm still going to keep playing this footage without any cuts, albeit sped up, so you can soak it in if need be. I thought about adding background music to this, but I felt as though it would undermine any educational integrity to this video. If you couldn't tell, the reason why this window came out imperfect is because the face it's being beveled out of isn't a perfect square. But there's no need to worry. Removing redundant edges, connecting vertexes, and adjusting them as per coordinates will make it look smooth and fix the issue. Although it's not impossible for windows to look fancy like this, for the sake of this tutorial, we're just doing simple rectangular windows, nothing too fancy. To give your building some depth, and as not to make it look like a box that's painted like a building, let's make some intrusions for the windows and doors. To start, select a face you wish to make a door or window and click on Extrude. To intrude, just click on Extrude Settings and put in a negative value. While of course you can eyeball it, I like having a consistent number to do intrusions based on. -5 is a bit too deep. How about -2? Let's meet in the middle and make it -2.5. And don't forget to delete the face on the ground you intruded from. Optimize! Now do the same for the backsliding glass door. For the windows, you can select them all at once and intrude them the same amount. Although let's select all but 2, leave one of the second-story windows and one of the first-story windows untouched for now. Most windows don't go as deep as doors do, so for this example, let's intrude them by 1 unit instead of 2.5 as we did with the doors. You can, in theory, intrude them with the same value as the doors, but it's nice to change things and keep them from getting too samey. You could just put in a window frame texture and you're done. But, for the sake of educating, let's make the 2 windows we didn't intrude a little more fancy by giving them a proper trim. First, select the vertical edges and connect them. Take the new edge and move it down toward the bottom of the window. This will be our window ledge, also known as a windowsill. Extrude it to, let me eyeball it. I think 1.5 is a good length for the windowsill. Now let's make it 2. Next, select the window itself and intrude it by 1 1/4, or 1.25 for those who don't know fractions. With the window still selected, go to Bevel Settings and play around with the outline. This will make up our window frame. Once you've found an acceptable width for the window frame, select the inner face and intrude it, but not by a whole lot. Let's say, less than 1. Yeah, like 0.75 or something. Now that we have that one done, let's get to something a little more complicated, a sash window. You might know this more as a window with a horizontal bar going through it. The process is the same as the first one. Connect the two edges to make a windowsill and move it down to an appropriate height. Then, you extrude the windowsill to an appropriate length. Like before, you select the window itself and intrude it to give it depth. Bevel the inside of that window. Now select the two vertical edges and connect them. Click on the newly divided faces and bevel the both of them. And same as before, intrude them no more than one. Just like on the reference prototype, make 3 separate panes for the sliding glass door by selecting the top and bottom faces of the back door, beveling them, and intruding them. The more you repeat it, the more you'll get the hang of it. Now that the house is almost done, let's fix up the proportions a little bit by stretching the model around, lowering vertexes, etc. Any final fixes like this you want to do before you apply textures. Otherwise, it will just be a huge pain in the ass to redo with textures. Also, if you see any edges that are just there for no good reason, remove them. Optimize. Oh fuck, you forgot the foundation. Hold on to your tits and take a deep breath. It's not the end of the world. First, make a secondary box that has the same dimensions as the house. An easy way to do this is by making the box first and then connecting the vertexes in the corner of the box to each vertex corner in the house. Second, select the house, move it up on top of the foundation, and then snap it down to it using the vertex snap. But don't connect the two yet. There's one more thing we have to do. We have to make steps leading to the house. Let's do a front stoop and a back patio. Connect the edges that should be the width of the stoop and extrude the face to make the stoop. Now extrude the stoop outwards by a little ways. Once you do that, connect the two edges at the front just once to make a step. Now extrude the step by about how much you extruded the stoop itself. It shouldn't be too long. Nice. Now let's do the back patio. Obviously, since it's a back patio, it should be wider and longer than the stoop. Now let's be a little artsy. Let's connect all the edges across the patio so there can be one nice step going the whole length around. Looking proper. Let's delete the bottom of the foundation, because optimization, and then connect the house to the foundation. There's one last thing this house needs before we can get started on texturing: a chimney. Same as any basic 3Dsmax object, it's just a box with the same width and length of all sides. Just put it in the roof where it should go and attach it to the house model. If you followed along this far, congratulations. If you haven't, you suck. Now it's time for the next section, texturing the building. One of the last parts of making the building model is texturing it. Good texture can make a good model even better, and bad textures can ruin a good model. Which of these looks better? The house with the photorealistic textures or the house with the Microsoft Paint textures? To be honest, the house with the photorealistic textures look crappy too, but I'm not teaching you how to make things look good. I'm teaching you how to make things. One thing that's important to consider are the texture sizes. To the best of my understanding, and I'm usually wrong, GTA 3's textures are no bigger than 128 by 128. Vice City's textures are no larger than 256 by 256, and San Andreas are no larger than 512 by 512. I've seen bigger texture size mods in each game, but I wouldn't know or remember much about how it was done. For this tutorial, we're going to make our texture sizes 512 by 512. So open up Photoshop, go to File, then New, and put in 512 for the width and height of the new image. Next, we find textures. Unless you're using textures directly from within the game already, you can skip this step, but I would be thoughtless if I don't mention these two sites. The first site I'd like to recommend is textures.com. I've been using them for a decade, and they've got nearly everything you need. The second site is sketchuptextureclub.com. I just started using it, but so far it seems like it has a good selection. Another good place to look for textures relating to windows, doors, etc. would be those for home improvement stores, like Home Depot, for example. They're good resources with images that can easily be turned into textures within a few clicks in Photoshop. Now that we know where to go, let's get our textures. Log on to textures.com and let's find a nice texture for the walls of our house. Since the real-life houses the model is based on used plaster walls, let's click on the plaster and see what selections they have. Make sure you're looking specifically for seamless textures, as they will be easily repeatable on the model. It's important to find something that looks worn in, but not something that looks like it was submerged underwater for a decade. I think this will look nice. Always make sure that the seamless preview looks good before you commit to it. Once you download it, take it to Photoshop and make it 512 by 512. You could either do this by opening the image and resizing it to that, or going to the new and empty 512 by 512 file you just made and copying it in there, as I'm doing now. Now save the texture. You should make a folder containing the 3Dsmax file for your model and put the textures in there. Optimize your organization, not just your models. Next, we need a texture for the weird break in the plaster on the original scale model that looks like some kind of wood siding, like this. This looks good enough and we don't even have to retexture it. Download it. Right-click the siding texture in Photoshop and rotate it 90 degrees, then resize it. Then save it with the other textures for the house. And make sure you give it a name that's easily identifiable. Now let's find a grubby foundation texture. I say grubby because, let's be real here, who's cleaning them in real life? This is a seamless texture that's only seamless from left to right, as opposed to up and down as well. It looks annoying, but it will add more detail that wouldn't look good on a fully seamless texture. So be mindful of that when you go to apply it. Are you digging the color? I'm not, but that's okay, because we can easily change it in Photoshop. Click on Image, go to Adjustments, and then click on Hue/Saturation. Turn the saturation bar all the way down to the left and hit OK. Looks good. Now let's save the image. Time to get a roof put on. Since the original roof is some kind of ceramic tile, let's look under the ceramic tile roofs for our model. This one don't look too bad. Let's grab it. Resize it to fit, and let's change the hue a bit like we did the last one by messing with the hue and saturation settings. Now, I would like to have a metal trim. I want it to clearly be metallic, but I don't want it to be obvious or overwhelming. What am I to do? I could download this one, but there's another trick that can help aid in that effect. Once it's placed in Photoshop and resized, create a square or whatever, something to cover the whole thing with whatever color you desire. In this case, I'm going with some kind of dark metallic gray. Then, place that over the texture you just downloaded in the Layer menu and move the opacity downwards until you can see just enough of the original texture through the new one, or to whatever value you like. Now let's get to texturing the building. Hooray! Let's get rid of our size references, since we don't need them anymore. So long! Farewell! Goodbye! Now on to texturing the building. Texturing in 3ds Max is easy. You select whatever faces you want to have, what material, drag the material onto it from the texture folder, and then map it. What I like to do from the start is selecting the whole building from the start and applying the trim texture to it, just because it's such a pain in the ass to manually select each and every little bit of it after the fact. Then to map the texture, click on the modifier list to the right of the screen. Scroll down to UVW Map and click it. In the mapping parameters, make sure Box is selected. Then click on the teapot in a window at the top of the screen to render the model so far. The detailing looks a little too big. Let's look at the length, width, and height values for our texture maps. Let's resize them to 20 units each and then render it to see how it looks. Not bad, but this is a render shown from far away. Let's zoom in to where the details will make a difference, like the window trim. There's some detail, but not a whole lot. Let's change the mapping values to 50 and see if that looks any better. Looks great. Before we move on to the next texture, let's right-click the UVW map in the modifier list and select Collapse All. Click on Yes, and we're ready to put the next texture on. One way to streamline the process of selecting faces to be textured is going into the 2D view and dragging on the faces you want to be textured. However, do be mindful that you actually select what you want to be textured, and no other faces you want to leave untouched for the time being. Get textured by accident. The selected faces will make up our foundation for the building. Select the foundation texture and drag it onto the selected faces. Remember earlier when I said the foundation texture is seamless only with width and not height? This means when you go to map the texture, you only need to change the length and the width values, since the height values are already set. Despite this, you should still try to get the values for length and width close to the height one, as it will look weird if you don't. If it looks janky, close to the original height value, just keep moving the values, and you'll see what looks right to you. See how weird a texture that isn't fully seamless looks when it's stacked height-wise? Don't worry. By selecting the faces and playing around with the alignment and size, we can get it to fit right in. Now let's spin around to the back and do the same for the patio. Now let's do the walls. You could select the walls the same way I did the foundation, but for whatever reason, I'm going through and manually selecting them. Sometimes having a nice podcast or radio show in the background, and doing this is the most relaxing, cleanest, best pleasure. Fortunately, I sped the footage up in post-production. I'm not actually selecting things this fast. And don't forget to select the parts of the wall that intrude into the windows. A lot of people forget to do that. Do the same for the parts of the house that have siding. Do not forget the parts of the walls that intrude into the windows and doors. This is a mistake that will cost you your friends, your family, your job, and your life. Looking a little big there, doesn't it? Let's make it a bit smaller to fit the original. Finally, let's get the roof textures mapped onto the model. And now, we can go about making door and window textures. Possibly the best place to get door and window textures, if not from texture sites, are from manufacturer or retailer sites. Here's the doors at Home Depot, for example. But as you can see, it won't let me right-click and save the picture. So I have to go on Google and look up the door just to find a suitable image we can use for textures. Now that we've got the door texture in Photoshop already, let's add some doorknobs, because most of the time, they aren't shown with them on retailer sites. Of course, you could take a picture of one off Google and use that one, but this is how you can make one in no time. Select the ellipse tool in Photoshop after picking out what color you'd like your doorknob to be, and shift-drag it to make a perfect circle over the doorknob hole. Add a very narrow stroke effect to give it some detail. Finally, go into the drop shadow effects and give it a faint bit of shadow to imply depth. The doorknob is done. Copy it, move it down, and resize it to make it into a keyhole. Also make a nice thin vertical slit for the hole. Resize the door to 512 by 512, and it's ready to be mapped onto the model. It's not the most matching door for the house type, but for the sake of learning, I hope y'all are getting something out of it. Now let's get some windows made. Once again, the best place to get them are from manufacturers or retailers. But in this instance, as was the case with the doors, we're just getting them from Google. Get the window into Photoshop and resize it to fit. Now, most people use curtains, blinds, or just plain black inside of their window textures. But for the sake of educating, I'll pull some hoarded-ass living room off of Google so we can use that as what we're looking inside into our house. Once you have the image in Photoshop and sized to fit, make a second layer and get the gradient tool ready. Go into your color picker and find the most window-looking texture. I know it sounds vague, but I usually go with some bluish, grayish, darkish color. With your new layer and the gradient tool selected, hold down the Shift key and drag downwards. This will make some kind of window effect, like you're looking into the house through the window. Select the house interior layer, go into Filters, then Blur, and Gaussian Blur. I sometimes do this to give the impression that there's something inside of the house, yet not to overwhelm the viewer. Put the window frame image over the other layers and remove the blank space inside of the frame. Congrats! You got a decent looking window now. Save the image, and don't forget to save it again, but without the frame for the part on the model where we physically modeled the window frame. Now let's find a window with a sash going through it for the upstairs windows, as seen on the reference model. It looks kind of crap, but here's a trick that I usually use. Copy the bottom half, because it's got more refined details, and paste it, rotated 180 degrees over the top half. If it's not a perfect half cut, you can get rid of some of it to reveal the horizontal sash. Once you're happy with the results, select both of the window layers, convert them to a smart object to make them one, and then rasterize them before you drag them to where you got the window background thing. As you did with the first window, remove the blank space from this window, and you're done. Applying the window textures to the model is the same as the other ones. If you modeled the window frame, select all the faces behind it, and then go through the same process. Even though they aren't physically touching, they'll be mapped as one. Now that the building is mapped, we can move on to the final section of the video, LODs. If you don't know what LODs are already, let me refresh your memory. See the grain elevator right there in the background? As the player moves further away from it, the model itself changes to a lower quality one. This ensues that the player can see the building at a distance, while, at the same time, the game doesn't have to render a fully detailed building when you're too far to notice any details. Remember earlier in the building modeling process, when I said I'd make a copy of the building before we added intrusions for doors and windows because it will make the LOD process easier? Here's the proof. First, we texture that one the same way we textured the original. Now go to the original model and select all the door and window faces. Once you have them selected, hold the Shift button and drag them upwards to the LOD model. When the Clone Part of Mesh pop-up appears, click on Clone to Object. Select the windows and doors in the LOD model and go into the 2D view. Once you're there, drag them out to where they're on top of the LOD model. Sure, you could say this is inefficient, but I've been doing it like this for years and haven't had any issues so far, or rather, any issues people told me about. Once you do this, select the LOD model, click on Attach, and select the door and window models. Now you have an LOD model with windows and doors. And don't forget to add roof textures to the LOD. I think I pretty much covered everything a beginner would need to know, except for one final thing. Making hip roofs. I didn't intend on this being part of the tutorial, but I'm throwing it in anyway just because I see so many houses like these in Florida. Select the face you intend to be your roof and click on Bevel Settings. Instead of just doing an outline, make sure you add a height value there as well. This will be your roof height. Get the outline as close to its edges as you can. Select two parallel edges on the top of the roof and make an edge. Delete the face on one edge, and using the Snap tool, connect the sloped part of the roof to the edge you just made. Do the same to the other side, and voila! A decent-looking hip roof. This concludes the tutorial. Have fun, and good luck making buildings.
That's all for this edition of Dateline Friday. I'm Chris Hansen. For Ann Curry and all of us at NBC News, good night.